So really there are two significant ways, different ways of being in life, as far as the context of these teachings, or at least the topic of these talks, is concerned. So firstly, what is the topic of these talks? And the answer is that these talks are about happiness for the human being in daily living. And so the two ways of being that relate to the topic of happiness for the human being in daily living is either a way of being where life is taken very personally, and when life is taken very personally, then that tends to lead to an uncomfortableness with oneself, and that is what would be described as unhappiness for the human being. And that's because so many things in life can be and will be taken personally if the psychological me that takes things personally is there. So that basically means that psychological me is going to continually be butting up and resisting, going against the flow of life. And the going against the flow of life is taking it personally, taking outcomes personally. Going with the flow is where outcomes are taken in one's stride, understanding that outcomes are going to be sometimes pleasurable, sometimes painful, understanding that the others are going to do things that are not what we would like, understanding that life is going to unfold one way, and that one way is not the way that we control, or we don't control the way it unfolds. And so if that becomes deeply ingrained, then the dynamics that resist life have fallen away. And what we will find is that there is a harmony with life, a going with the flow, a becoming one with life, meaning there isn't someone resisting what is happening. This still is the experience of a person. We could say there still is a human being having the experience of life. However, that human being is not structured in a way anymore that is in opposition with life, but rather is in harmony with life, even when life is not favorable. And that essentially is acceptance. Acceptance is finding yourself structured in such a way that the resistance to life doesn't arise. Why doesn't the resistance to life not arise? Because the part of ourselves that was forced to resist life in the past, because we saw life as something that should be one way and not another, a part of us that imagined that its completeness would be found in life looking a certain way, and therefore felt highly challenged and attacked by life not turning out a particular way, that part has fallen away. And so if that identity, if that part of us has fallen away, it's not there to jump in and react to life. And so that's referred to in this teaching as the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. The attitude of personal doership is the attitude that sees oneself as the one in charge and in control, sees the others as in charge and in control, and therefore assumes that everything that unfolds in life is my doing and the other's doing, and if it's not in line with our preferences or our expectation, then we say, oh, we should have and we could have done it differently, which is really an attitude of regret, an attitude where we will blame the other and hate the other for them having decided to act a certain way, and where we will blame and hate ourselves, which is guilt and shame, in the situation where our functioning has led to unfortunate circumstance, we will have an attitude towards ourselves that says, I should have and I could have done it differently. And why should I and could I, or why should I have done it differently? Because the way I did it delivered pain, and pain is the opposite of what I believe as the doer is what I need in order to one day be complete and happy. So the attachment to outcome is a self-identity that is invested in and feels defined by circumstance and outcomes. So that is the attitude towards life, towards circumstance, towards situations, towards the flow of life, which means however life is unfolding in each moment. That is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. I am the doer, you are the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And in general terms, we can say that this attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome is deeply ingrained in human beings. It seems to be the default software, the default structuring of or the default structure that gets put in place as part of the development of a human being from let's say sperm and egg to fetus to baby to infant to child to teenager to adult. As that happens, the default is to see oneself as the doer and believe one's happiness and completeness is to be found in outcomes. Now, quite simply, the reason that that gets put in place is that unless we go diving into a below the surface investigation, it feels like I am in control. It feels like I am the doer. And therefore, because that's the momentary experience that keeps repeating itself for our whole life, the assumption, I wouldn't expect it to be any other way, is I am the doer. And so that sort of gets put in place in significant enough quantity at the age of, let's say, 2.5 to 3 years old, where the sense of self really starts to solidify in a child. And the assumption is that I and you are the one that are making things happen this way. And it becomes very personal. And there is an attachment to things, which is why childs start tantruming and whatever. And that continues to be the assumption of how life is. And so our sense of self gets ingrained with the assumption I am the doer, because that's how it feels on the surface experientially, and the best we know in life is pleasure, as opposed to pain. And because we haven't seen that happiness is about or that unhappiness is really about the attitude to circumstance, rather than the pleasure or pain of the circumstance itself, because we haven't seen that, and because the unhappiness, which is an attitude towards pleasure and pain, is highly correlated to circumstance. And so then the assumption is that my uncomfortable feeling is about circumstance. So the subtlety of seeing it to do with our attitude hasn't been seen. So then it just assumes it's about circumstance. And so the assumption is that I can have in life is if life was one day pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so that becomes the modus operandi. So happiness for the human being, as defined in this teaching, and whatever I say, whatever anyone else has ever said, whatever is written down, past, present, or future, is always a concept and not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. I exist. That is undeniable. It's prior to concepts. It is a primordial sense that is at the base of the whole life experience. It is the substratum, you can say, at the lowest common denominator of our daily life experience. That there is something that is, and that's not a concept. We don't. It's something that can be known directly by ourselves prior to thinking. Attention just needs to land on the fact that at any point in time, I am. And when I say I'm not, the I am is not necessarily, or actually it's not at all referring to I am Roger, a male, 47 years old, this, that, and the other. That's the personal characteristics. And prior to all of those things having a platform to sit on, there is just the impersonal sense of existence. And the more often we become quiet and become present and appreciate this amazing experience, maybe appreciate, where did it come from? What is it? I know it is the experience of a world of form and time and space and humans and other humans, but what is it really? Is it that? Is it just us being in a world, or is it something different to that? And as we open up to these questions, where is all of this experience arising? Who's having it? Who am I? The questions are really, at some point, we stop trying to answer them with clever intellectual answers. We might realize that all our theories, all our concepts about what is real, what is unreal, remain at some point open for debate. They are not absolute. They may be misguided. We could be pretty sure about something, and usually we're pretty sure about something just simply because we haven't been presented with an argument that argues the other side in sufficient, or an alternative, in sufficient ways for us to realize that there is an alternative explanation to the one that we think is the truth. And if we just open up to the fact that actually I can't rule that out completely, some alternative, then we say, well, in that case, I can't rule in completely the one I'm choosing. And that's a great liberation when we realize the difference between, I like the sound of this, I think that it can't be that way, often because we don't really understand a topic so well. And we just pick an explanation for something. And especially when it comes to, for example, what is life, or a question, not that we ask this question, but do aliens exist? They're sort of questions that are in the field of the unknown. And so someone might say, no, aliens don't exist. And really we might find, and I'm not saying I think they do, but I don't know. And someone who says they know, or really what they're saying is, I like the idea that they don't exist. And so that's what I'm picking. And it's really a bit of bad thinking to see a topic that really is unknown and think we know. So remember, the talks are about happiness in daily living. Happiness is not to be found in pleasure being the standard, but rather in our attitude to the circumstance or to the flow of life, which is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. The attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome is the attitude that creates unhappiness, uncomfortableness. This we need to feel. So the description there is a pointer for you to feel in your own daily life that circumstance is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, that circumstance will only ever be pleasure or pain, and that our happiness and in fact our unhappiness are always because of our attitude to the circumstance. And until we see this, then our attitude to circumstance, because it is an attitude of attachment, our attitude to circumstance and the circumstance itself will seem to be the one thing. And then it will just seem like we are unhappy because of circumstance, because of what the other has done and what we might have done, because of the weather or whatever the outcomes are. And that simply is a big problem. If that's the structure we have in place, that is the structure that forces uncomfortableness to be there. So happiness is the dissolving of that attitude. How does it dissolve? It dissolves when life is described differently, when the descriptions of life allow us to think, oh, I haven't thought of it that way. Oh, that challenges my deeply ingrained beliefs or even my conscious beliefs. And we start to say, I'm curious to find out what makes more sense. So sometimes we might consciously, if asked, say, oh, I don't think my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And yet, in practice, when someone does something, we might see that the resistance, the uncomfortableness, the unhappiness that arises, not necessarily as the biological reaction, but as the ongoing uncomfortableness and unhappiness with a situation, regret in the past for the things that happened in the past, or expectation in the future. But I'm using the example of when someone does something, and that story towards that person for what they did can extend in time, and you will hate someone for a long period of time. You will resent them. You will have mental stories about them and an attitude that they are your enemy and they are a competitor or a rival. And that can extend for long periods of time. And so if we see this, we can then conclude, oh, look, even though I consciously believe or consciously understand that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, deep down, in practice, from time to time, someone does something and the response is one of psychological suffering, blame, let's say, that extends horizontally in time. So then we learn from that, and we say, oh, I understand in theory that happiness isn't to be found in outcomes and that the other isn't the doer. And in practice, deep down in my system, the opposite belief exists because it gets triggered. The response tells us, the response shows us that we have this deeply ingrained idea that I am attacked circumstance and the other is the doer and they shouldn't have done that and I have to feel uncomfortable with them. I can't just let that go. Our response shows us that that is in place. So then we can investigate it. Then we can hopefully hear more, understand more descriptions of why, for example, the other is not the doer, why everyone is functioning the way they do, which is out of your control, out of their control. Maybe come to see that that is destiny unfolding, that all of life is God's will, or I didn't say God's will because I need to insert God into the picture. In fact, frankly, it would be better if we can leave God as God out of it. And the main purpose is to of using God is to realize that what is unfolding, including my very existence as part of what is unfolding, is a result of something, whatever it is. And that I am not the orchestrator, the creator, the doer of myself or what's happening. And so if we come to see life like that, the human being is significantly changed. There's a relaxation that kicks in, a capacity for a whole range of mental thinking, guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And those categories of thinking are categories that just keep on extending for long periods of time habitually, and one will take over from the other. And so we can find that there's no peace, there's no quiet in our thinking. It doesn't often get the opportunity because it doesn't see any point in being quiet. In fact, it assumes that all of those functionings of what we can call the thinking mind are beneficial. That's what it assumes. And because the system assumes that's beneficial, it does them. It assumes that that is somehow taking us closer to our objective, whereas in fact, it is the very opposite of our objective. Assuming the objective is, as I've suggested, and that is for human beings, whether we realize it or not, we're looking for peace of mind in daily living. And the thinking mind, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, is the opposite of peace of mind. Peace of mind is the absence of the thinking mind. So for the thinking mind to stop, the carpet needs to be pulled from under it. And how does the carpet get pulled from under it? When we start to see life as a happening. When we start to see life as a creation, and we are intrinsically part of the creation. If we see the present moment as an extrusion of life or a result of everything that came before, that all of the past has culminated in what is expressing itself in this moment. And then this moment becomes part of the past that then culminates as the next moment. And so each moment, each present moment is the ever unfolding crest of the wave. And we're surfing that wave not as a separate entity that is separate to the wave and surfing it, but we are part of the unfolding wave. If we start to see life like that, then the personalness, the I made this happen, you made it happen, falls away. And that's pulling the wool from under the dynamic of doership and attachment to outcomes. All of the guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, when we look at it and see it as an attitude, a way of interpreting how things happen, all of the suffering, which is an attitude to circumstance, is built on the belief that life could have been different and I did it wrong, you did it wrong, and we could have done it differently. As soon as we see life as this big moving wave and we are part of it, then this idea, oh, I should have done it differently, is a ludicrous thought to us. It's like, oh, that's not compatible. How can I see life as an unfolding that I am part of, meaning a bit like a movie unfolding, and it's already happened. The characters have played their roles, and the movie's playing itself out, and it's only going to play itself out one way. And so to look back at the movie and say, oh, that character should have done something different, is only something we can do when there is a misunderstanding about what we're seeing. So there needs to be, in order for this to go deeper and deeper, a seeing of life a certain way. And there's many different ways we can see life, many different explanations that demonstrate the non-doership, the fact that life is out of our control. And that might sound like a bad news. Life is out of our control. In fact, it's salvation. When life is seen to not be my doing, sure, I am the instrument through which certain things happen, but who is here doing it? So when it's seen that, I will calculate something and get the right answer or the wrong answer, and whether I get the right answer or the wrong answer might have implications on how much money I end up in my wallet after handing the shopkeeper a $50 note. I might do a calculation and think that I've got the right change when in fact I haven't. So there may be a consequence, but the fact is whether I get it right or wrong is a result of a very complex set of processes that the one that then comes in and says, oh, you really should have got that right. The one that comes in and says you really should have got that right is the attitude that thinks that there is someone who was in control of getting it right or wrong. Whereas when we look at it, we have a human being that is very complex and has gone through, let's say, school or hasn't gone through school. And in a particular moment, the brain calculates things and gives an answer as a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so the answer is as good as the hardware and software is programmed, designed, and functioning in that moment. And so even if you've gone to school and studied maths and all sorts of things, you still are prone to sometimes getting things wrong, getting calculations wrong, because we don't understand how the brain is going to work in a given circumstance because we're not in control of it. And to the extent that you get things right often, like, oh, I never calculate anything wrong. My mental arithmetics is fantastic. That, well, and that can be the case. You can have someone that is consistently getting the right answer in terms of mental arithmetics, but that's because their genes and up-to-date conditioning is a particular way, and so they can be impressed with the fact that they get the calculations right so consistently. There's no problem with being impressed because it happens, and you see that out of 1,000 calculations, you get 1,000 right. So it's impressive. But to take personal ownership over it is where the attitude of personal doership comes in. And if that happened, then that would be pride. It's like, oh, look how good I am as a doer, would be the attitude. I got it right 1,000 times out of 1,000 times. Whereas if you see that that is happening based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, you can be impressed. You go, I'm impressed with myself that I have got it right 1,000 times out of 1,000 times. And let's say the average is for people to get it right 600 times out of 1,000 times. Right? And you have got it right 1,000 times out of 1,000 times, 4 times in a row. 1,000 times out of 4 times. You've done the test. It's impressive, and so it's okay for you to be impressed. However, as soon as that impressiveness includes, oh, I did it because I'm personally in control and so good, that's when it's turned into pride. If you say, I'm impressed, but I understand that I keep getting these scores because of the gift of a particular intellect, let's say, that can calculate numbers and get it right. And hopefully we realize in any moment, you know, if that person has a stroke, they may not get it right anymore because the machinery might be affected. And importantly, when our attachment to outcomes and seeing all of this as impersonal, when that happens, the involvement is not there anymore. The importance in outcomes starts to diminish. And what we find is an awareness of something more primal than outcomes, an awareness of something more primal than the mechanical movements of speech, of thinking, even of feelings. When we realize all of that is mechanical. Now, because it's mechanical doesn't mean I'm reducing it down to something less than it is. If I say that the feeling of love is mechanical, which can easily be argued on one from a certain perspective, it doesn't mean that the feeling of it is going to feel mechanical. So I'm not reducing life down to anything less than it already is. Describing it as mechanical doesn't mean that the appreciation for art, let's say, or the love for your friends is going to be any different. It's just a description of that depth of human experience. And it just puts it into a healthier context, which doesn't mean we no longer appreciate it, but it means that our investment in it starts to automatically fall away, where it still happens, but we understand that that's a happening. And then it allows an attention to land on what I described earlier as more primal than the content of what is happening. The very sense of existence that arises simultaneously with content that is at any point when there is life experience, there is content, and there is always this simultaneous sense of I am, I exist, there is existence, and awareness of that existence and the present moment. And an appreciation of that aspect of life, that aspect of the human being, allows us to rest, to be quiet, much, much more than when there is attachment to outcome and doership. The narratives of guilt, blame, pride, they don't make sense. We just are finding it much more meaningful. We see that life itself is about the experience in the present moment. That becomes a little more obvious when you get challenged with your mortality sometimes. And then you realize, maybe I've overlooked the purpose of life. If we really start to see the fact that life at any point can come to an end, then we start questioning, what is it exactly that is important? And appreciating life for the fact that there is life. Appreciating the very, and I don't mean having a feeling of appreciation, but rather being present with the fact that we are, that we exist. And that means being present with that aspect and resting there. So one of the hallmark characteristics of non-attachment and non-doership is that we can discern. So from one perspective, we might say there is no such thing as good or bad, it just is. And that's really talking about our attitude rather than whether there is fundamentally good or bad, pleasure or pain. It's really, when it says there is no such thing as good or bad, life just is, it's pointing at two ways of how our attitude towards circumstance can be. We can have an attitude that says, oh, that is good, I want it because that is my happiness. And that is bad, oh, that shouldn't be that way. And so really what it's talking about is not that there is no good or bad, because relative, let's say, to our biological preferences or relative to many specific benchmarks that are put in place, then things that happen are either good or bad relative to a specific benchmark. But that's not where our suffering is. Our suffering is in our attitude of resisting and craving. And so a teaching will sometimes say there is no such thing as good and bad in life. It just is what it is. And the reason that it's being described like that is because we have grown up labeling everything and judging things as either appropriate or inappropriate, and dependent on whether it meets our expectations or it doesn't. And so the teachings are saying, actually, you're projecting onto what is the idea of what should be or what shouldn't be. And there is a way of just seeing what is directly. And that way of seeing what is directly is to understand that life is this creation, this oneness arising in each moment, and that the oneness includes interconnected opposites. And that is the nature of this one experience, that it has pleasure and pain, good outcomes, bad outcomes, and that they are all part of the one. And so from an attitudinal perspective, in order to not be in opposition with the one, to be in harmony with the one, which in fact makes us part of the one, there needs to not be, or there needs to be the absence of the attitude that says this should be and this shouldn't be. That attitude is separating us from being in harmony with the one. And so we're told it just is what it is, which is encouraging our commentary, our attachment, to slow down. And because each time once that's been described to us and we think, oh, wow, that's interesting. And then each time our thinking mind kicks in and says, no, that shouldn't be like that, the thought might arise, actually, it is what it is. And that thought can cut off the, no, it shouldn't be like that, because it gets seen in that moment to be the superimposing of our shoulds and shouldn'ts over what is. And so I was talking about one of the hallmarks of this understanding is we then get to see our shortcomings and don't need to defend them, and don't need to feel criticized when someone points out a shortcoming, which is not what our normal sense of self is designed for. Our normal sense of self is attached to pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so it's averse to actually acknowledging any shortcomings. It feels like acknowledging any shortcomings is an attack on itself. And when that identity falls away, you become very willing to say, yes, I agree, I have this shortcoming, and these good points. And both the shortcomings are seen as impersonal. So, you know, if you fall asleep at 6 o'clock in the evening, every evening, or as soon as you go out with friends, you fall asleep. And they say to you, you know, you're always falling asleep on us. It's a social shortcoming of yours. And you might say, yes, I agree. It's because you see it. You see, yes, I fall asleep at 7:30 or 6 o'clock or whatever it is. And it happens because I'm tired or whatever, which is out of my control. It happens. So I'm not going to argue against the fact that it's a shortcoming. It is a shortcoming. I agree with you. You're right. You have discerned the situation correctly. And then similarly, without this attachment, you can point it out in someone else. You go, hey, you know, this is not ideal. You're not doing that job very well, which isn't you're not blaming them or seeing them as the doer, but you're just seeing the fact that they're not doing the job very well. So you can point it out. Now, the thing is, what you learn is that someone is going to take that personally if the belief in personal doership is very much in place. They don't want to, they can't acknowledge with peace that yes, they have a shortcoming. And that's when the defensiveness kicks in. And so then it's understandable when you see someone being defensive and you think, well, I'm just pointing out this. It's like, I don't blame you because you're doing it according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. My hope is that if I point it out and I explain something, then maybe that will stop happening because it's beneficial to me for that to stop happening. But I understand that the outcome is not in my control. So I explain it with the hope that you get better at it, which is in some situations going to be better for me. But I know that my explanation may not be sufficient that you become good at it. And so there's no attachment to the outcome. But it doesn't make sense to see someone doing something not very well and clap for them. Now, in some situations, it might. It might be deemed that in some situations, telling someone that they have not done it correctly is more harmful than good. And that's just a personal. And so you might You know, if you've got a child and they've got certain obvious limitations that aren't going to be overcome, then it may be much more beneficial to tell them that they've done a wonderful job when relative to certain benchmarks they haven't, but those benchmarks are not relevant to you as a parent. What you're interested in is giving love to your child and child. So it would make sense in that situation to tell them, yes, you have done a very good job. And in fact, it's true if you can see that the child is putting in effort and trying really hard, then you're not lying. Yes, you've done a wonderful job. But in some situations, it's more pragmatic to say, look, you haven't done this very well. Not with the intention of hurting the other, although the likelihood is the other is automatically going to take it personally and get hurt. But that's not your intention. And so when you see them getting hurt, well, there is the option to apologize, or sometimes it is worth leaving the person to work through their suffering, because essentially that's what it is. It's taking a shortcoming that has been pointed out to you and feeling personally attacked that someone has pointed out a shortcoming. And the feeling personally attacked is because of this belief in personal doership, which says my completeness is to be found when I am perfect. And so if someone tells you you're not perfect, it is felt like that is an attack, whereas in fact it's all the feeling of attack is because we have an unhealthy relationship to what is. So anyhow, as I was saying, this change happens as we hear explanations and we start to see for ourselves certain dynamics that are in place, and we question certain things. We question why we're taking something personally. We maybe can start to see that, yes, I can just discern things that are good or bad relative to certain benchmarks, and it doesn't have to be a judgment. And slowly in time, hopefully the belief in personal doership falls away and life becomes much less personal. Still rich. Life continues. We continue to have the human experience, but without the guilt and the blame and the pride, the worry, anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcome. But we can't make that happen. We can't say, oh, I'm not going to feel anxious. That's not how it works. If the system is still structured a certain way, anxiety will happen. And our attitude needs to be towards the suffering as the same as has been described in the Satsang, an attitude of, well, it is what it is. Not my doing. Even the suffering is a happening according to the creation. So we'll take some questions. Hi, Eric.
Hello, Roger. See if I can get my video going here. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, good. I can't hear you so well, so I'm just going to raise the volume a little bit here. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you so much again, Roger. It almost feels strange to ask a question after all this clarity, and you're so to the point. But so it maybe just a little bit checking in here from my part and see what your comments are on it. And
Great. Okay.
one funny thing I just wanted to mention is that an example of how my working mind is picking up your pointings. I had a very complicated thought process the other day, and my mind was struggling with something. And then what I saw as the working mind came in, and I apologize for the bad imitation now, but it came in and said, "Who cares?" with your accent, and it was great. It was just gone.
Yeah, great. That's that's very good. Who cares is great. Ramesh used to have a clock um, that someone had designed for him, I think, and all the numbers on the clock were collapsed at the bottom of the clock, and then on the face of the clock there were the words "Who cares?"
Yeah,
And yeah, so that's a very powerful. It's like what it's saying is who cares. It's saying like who cares. So
yeah,
something it could be written like who question mark cares.
yeah.
But it also has the other meaning like who cares like oh it's not important. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Um,
first the who cares, and then when you realize who cares, it's like who cares?
you got it. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, my process now is yeah, I feel like the understanding of non-doership, that no one is doing anything. That is, and you're making it, you, Ramesh, and Gautam, which I also been listening to, makes that so clear. And
Uh-huh.
it's so obvious that I just sometimes I just laugh at it, and sometimes I feel like who, how can anyone ever believe that anyone has ever done anything when I have no idea how to speak. I mean, which muscles do I use in the synchronized way so speak happens and breathe? It's just so obvious.
Uh-huh. Yes.
So I got this um, uh, this thing that you said. I mean, I simply cannot be the doer. It feels like
Mhm.
I'm having that all the time, and
Um,
yet it's like my I get caught in thought streams and I identify with feelings and stuff. So it's a little bit confusing that
mhm.
something can be so obvious and clear, and then not clear when I get caught in thought streams. So and then I wonder a little bit if it because when thinking happens, it really feels like I'm thinking then when I'm caught. So it feels like
Mhm.
that's why I get caught. And when Eric is doing things, it really feels like I'm the one doing it, and that's why I get caught in it. So
Mhm.
I guess if there is a question, it would be about because sometimes I feel like maybe I need to go up
To
there,
go up there.
total transcendence, and come back um,
Mhm.
to, to really, really see that everything is just happening and then come back. Because it feels like for the understanding to penetrate the system. What would you say about that, Roger? And then, am I missing the peak experiences? Am I lacking those?
Um, no, well, I mean, it depends. Everyone's destiny is different in the path, and a lot of people come into non-duality, and go get the esoteric top-down. You're not a person. You're formless awareness, and have a shift into a seeing because of just a witnessing, being the witness, where it's very obvious that from this new platform, the tree and the person is really a modulation of consciousness. just different vibrating energy, let's say, and the world of form from the witnessing perspective. And I'm not talking about the body doing witnessing, but rather where even the body is seen as part of the world of form, and what we feel like we are. When I say we feel, the sense of I shifts out of the body and feels like it is just formless awareness. Now, I say that that's still a human state that doesn't feel like a human state. I think it's still the human being having that state, but it feels like it is beyond the person. And that to me is like an impersonal, personal state. So the most impersonal feeling, personal state. So all states in daily life, I mean, not only daily life, but even in meditation, it's still to me a personal state. But meditation, as you probably know, there are many meditations that feel very impersonal. And so I hope you understand what I mean. It's an impersonal, personal experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when that sets in, life is sort of seen from a different platform, and time, the past, and the future tend to become seen as concepts, seen as existing simply because of memory, for example, and expectation. And so attention is very much on the present moment. And it seems like, from that point of view, life would be described quite differently to when we are living it more as the person being pragmatic and functional. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong, is they're really seeing life from two different platforms, where we can, from one platform, see everything is just spontaneously arising and collapsing, and is nothing is the same, and the sense of the person is just arising in the moment and then collapsing and then re-emerging and collapsing, or continually in change. There is no one that is really there in consistent form. The thoughts are always changing. Sometimes there's the body experience with no thoughts. Sometimes there's the body experience with emotions, and inevitably the emotions are, short-lived. The thoughts are short-lived, or at least always changing. And so, at some point, especially from the witnessing point of view, it becomes clear that there is no one or anything except the experience. And that's correct from that perspective. And at the same time, that's not really where life needs to get lived from. And so coming back and saying, yes, but from this perspective, the table, when I'm touching it, which you don't tend to be doing when you're just sitting witnessing, it feels solid pragmatically. The sense of time exists because memory arises automatically, and I feel like I'm a person in a world of form. And that is also a valid perspective of life. And so neither description is the absolute truth. They are true from their own, they're true descriptions from each perspective. And it's true that the non-doership can maybe, the understanding of non-doership might sink in even more if certain peak experiences happen, if certain shifts to the transcendence happen. But I don't think it's necessary. I think that as long as even from with less of that, we can still see non-doership eventually. And that doesn't mean that, the other way would be more efficient. I don't think that. I think everyone has their different path, and I wouldn't say that they all need to include the transcendent. But it can be as simple as meditating or just sitting witnessing knowing you're the person, but knowing that the person can have these impersonal times in meditation where you just, in a sense, it is witnessing, but you don't need to go and spend months lost in esoteric being not the person. You can do it for half an hour or 10 minutes every day. And that to me it seems very healthy. And the non-doership, the happeningness can happen just by sitting, allowing everything to be as it is, allowing the sense that awareness isn't functioning through the body, doesn't use the eyes to see, doesn't use the ears to hear, that everything that is aware, is sensed, must be within the field of awareness. Otherwise, the sound of the car or the dog wouldn't be there if it was outside. So then we can get a sense that everything is inside. And it's clearly it's not inside the body, but it's inside the field of awareness. And what is aware is that field of awareness, and it doesn't need a body, which is a contradiction to what I would say when we're describing life from the pragmatic, practical point of view. But now I was just describing it while you're sitting in meditation, allowing everything to be. And so that's great when we have this flexibility of saying neither of those descriptions are the absolute truth, and yet they are very much fluid states, you can say, that are available to the human being, and can be beneficial to the deep understanding of non-doership. The explanation of why you find the getting lost in thought and feeling like you are the doer from time to time, even though at other times you have this, how can anyone possibly interpret life as if they are the doer when I'm not doing the speaking? I don't know how all the muscles and everything work. The reason that is because there are our system, there's the old understanding and the new understanding coming in. And the new understanding is going deeper and deeper and deeper. And as it goes deeper and deeper and deeper, it uproots the old understanding, but it doesn't uproot it all in one go. It sort of uproots it as it's going deeper and deeper. And so for a period of time, there are both understandings in the system, and sometimes one is triggered and sometimes the other is in play. And so that's the explanation I would put forward as to why we find us going flip-flopping. But what you'll see probably is that as the understanding of non-doership kicks in, when the getting lost in thought does happen, involvement, when it does happen, it will get cut off quicker and quicker and quicker. And the intensity of it as an average will get less and less and less. And that's a sign of the understanding going deeper, where you say, look, the suffering used to hang around for an hour, now I see it getting cut off after 10 minutes. And then at some point you might say, now I see it getting cut off after 2 minutes, and then it's getting cut off after 30 seconds. And that to me is the process.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Roger. It's amazing. It came up more questions, but you answered them. You just ticked them off as you were going. But one last thing, and it's I probably not. I mean, I can't do nothing about anything. But it's when I get lost in these thought trains, and I know that you have described this many times before. It's a little bit difficult for me sometimes to discern what is working mind and what is thinking mind in those, and that that can be felt like a bit of a problem sometimes, because I think I'm a little bit trapped still in thinking is altogether bad. But I think that comes in because because I feel disappointed when I feel identified with the thinking. So even if it's the working mind thinking, I feel identified with that. Like that's my thinking, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to know that ultimately, it is only the thinking mind thinking that's the problem. Um, and so at least we can hold it as a concept without an attachment to it, that the working mind thinking in the end has to be there. Otherwise, we won't be able to function in life. Um, and yet, if you see that even the working mind thinking can, uh, um, involvement in working mind, there are times when we should sit. I don't mean should as in, this is what you should do, but we start to feel that, oh, there are times when let me put a rest to both the thinking and the working mind, and just be, really just be without any concepts. Because until that capacity to just be is really strong, until that happens, the working mind, which includes so much thinking of causality, of time, of being a person with outcomes, that any residual attachment to outcomes, any being lost in, or seeing life exclusively as causal, will get triggered by the fact that the working mind does think pragmatically in terms of time and space and outcomes and things relative to the body. And so there are times when, and maybe even extended period of times, where we cut off all sorts of thinking. No, you can't do it for the whole day, but it's like there will be a motivation to think less overall for to just allow this being to set in.
Yeah, that I really needed to hear. I think there is where I am, exactly where I am right now. It
Yeah,
sounds very peaceful.
yeah. Well, I think you're on your way. Um, Very nice of you to drop in
Thank
anytime
you
you
so
feel
much,
like it.
Roger. Thank you so much for doing this.
Pleasure. Hi, Shex.
Hi, hi. Um, so thank you so much for the satsang. I've been listening to you for the past few days, and my question is, when we begin to see life in the manner that you describe, uh, where does action arise from, or uh, w- what is our relationship with action in this
Mm.
way of seeing where we are the non-doer?
Yeah, so action has always been happening, and action will continue to happen. So the non-doership is really how we interpret what action is and where it comes from. So the attitude of non-doership isn't going to change our action. It's not going to make us inactive. All it does is it means that we will interpret our attitude to what action happens. The attitude towards that will be different than it was before. Before, it was, this is my action that I am doing of my own free will and volition, and I'm in control of my action, and I'm in control of the outcome. That's the attitude of doership. which is really an attitude that kicks in after the action has initiated. But because it kicks in so quickly and it's our general sense of self, we can't see that it is kicking in after the action. And once we start to see that the human being isn't in control of how they are and how they function and what the outcome is, then our attitude, we start to see, wow, this taking ownership and claiming it as if I could have done it differently is misguided. And so then action will continue to happen, but our attitude to it is different. So there are some experiments that have been undertaken, and the experiments sort of demonstrate this point quite well. Now, I'm not trying to say that an experiment is the proof that is needed, but it can be part of our thinking. So it comes in at the explanation of the experiment and the outcomes that are found. It comes in, and then it can be part of what supports our seeing of life differently. So there's two experiments, and people often get them mistaken. And they show different things, but they both show the non-doership of how life is happening. The first experiment is one that shows that the conscious awareness of a decision having been made or an action is registered about 0.2 or 0.3 of a second after it actually happens in the body. So that can be, with testing equipment of EEGs and that measure the electromagnetic pulses in the brain, etc., shows that we become consciously aware of a decision or an action 0.3 of a second or 0.2 of a second after the decision is actually made by the mechanism of the body. And so if we trust that information, which I'm not saying trust it blindly, but unless you have a reason to think that unless you have a strong reason to think it's incorrect, it starts to help prove the point. If we trust that information, the implication is, I think that I am before the decision, the conscious part of me, right, which is the part that says, I shouldn't have done that. What the implication of it shows, I think I am before the decision, but actually the one that becomes aware only after the decision has been made by the mechanics of the body. And the second experiment that sort of complements the implication here is that the scientists that were carrying out the experiment, a different experiment, were able to determine 8 seconds, I think it is. 8 seconds is a long time. 8 seconds before a final decision was made, what decision was going to be made by the person. And the way that this was carried out is that, so people were given, let's say, a choice of 2 answers to a question. And because there's a thinking process, let's say the thinking process is a minute long, and it might even be longer than 8 seconds, I'm not sure, but in a way the scientists can see which part of the brains are lighting up for people. And when they saw it for enough people, they can see the correlation of when certain things are happening in the brain as to what the answer is going to be for that type of thinking. And so with a high degree of certainty, when enough indicators happen in someone's thinking, the scientists can call the answer 8 seconds or 10 seconds before the person actually decides. because it's showing that the chain of cause and effect has been set in place, and the answer is inevitable, which shows the mechanistic mechanism of thinking and decision making. So in a way, what it's saying is it's all predetermined. We don't know what is predetermined. This, I won't say that, but ultimately it's predetermined. And if we can set up simulations or understand systems enough, we can know what is predetermined. When the system becomes too complicated, then there's too many variables and we don't know what's going to happen. But in this case, because of the consistency of the question, and the scientists were able to know what is going to be picked before the person has made the decision 8 seconds before. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. When I look at, can you hear me?
Oh, I couldn't hear you. So,
Yeah.
in case.
Now I can speak. Right? Uh, So when I see Buddha or even somebody like J. Krishnamurti, I see them taking uh, some kind of deliberate action that seems to be directed to an outcome. Buddha traveled all over India, Sri Lanka. He tried to uh, convey his message, and he formed sanghas and organizations around his work. Krishnamurti
Mhm.
founded schools and also founded organizations, copyrighted his work. So I'm just wondering, where is that? What is the? So it looks like outcome directed action to me, doesn't it? I mean, I'm just curious about that. How that works?
Yeah. So often, if we talk about the falling away of attachment to outcomes, the working mind of someone listening to it might interpret that as meaning something a bit more than it actually means. So the falling away of attachment to outcomes is the falling away of the psychological entity that says, I need this to happen, I'm going to make it happen, and I'm in control. And so then we say, well, if attachment to outcome falls away, what will make us do anything? That, I think, essentially is your question. And the answer is our biological preferences. When our attachment to outcome falls away, which is a psychological attitude to outcomes, we still will function in life even without attachment to outcome, because hunger will arise, because tiredness will arise, because we will see someone in need, and as part of our biological preferences, seeing someone in need inspires a movement to help. For some people, and for other people, they're not going to have that movement because the biological preferences are different. And so when it comes to someone like the Buddha or Krishnamurti, understanding that there is a different way of living, a different way of being, and that different way of being comes in when life is described differently, when a seeker receives guidance in the form of teachings, then there is a compulsion to share the knowledge, the information, with a very clear intent of making a difference, but now the attachment to the outcome is not there. From Buddha wouldn't be attached to him actually making a difference. He would be very hopeful that the teachings will make a difference, but understands that it's not in his control. And so the action is inspired by one's biological preferences when attachment to outcome falls away.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you.
I can hear you now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for your response. And thank you for the satsang every day.
You're very welcome. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for doing this, by the way. I was always thanking you, but I'm very grateful for you doing this. Yeah, but
You're welcome.
I've got a question, but I want to tell you something that happened this morning. I was going through some paperwork from about a decade ago this morning, trying to sort it all out, and got really quite emotional and thinking, oh, I shouldn't be like this. I should be back doing what I was doing a decade ago when I was happy. And I suddenly thought, I don't know what to do. And I thought, well, I'll go and buy some fruit to have with my cereal. I like fresh fruit with cereal. And I went to the local greengrocers and bought some strawberries, some cherries. I was walking back and I was thinking, well, all this teaching from Roger is really interesting, but how can you apply it to everyday living? And I suddenly thought, oh, I'm going to eat some of these cherries. And a voice said to me, no, you've got to wait till you get home to eat the cherries. And then I thought, no, you can only eat the cherries once. And I started to eat this cherry and it tasted wonderful. And I suddenly realized that that's what we're here for, is to eat cherries and enjoy it. Because it occurred to me that, yeah, if we're dead, you probably can't taste cherries, you know, if that makes any sense.
I'm on your side there.
There's something you said earlier, this comes to my question. You said about parts of us, and it's very interesting you talk about parts, because I've done quite a lot of IFS, internal family systems therapy, which was developed by an American called Dick Schwartz. I don't know if you're, and he identified that we're made up of all these parts, and that these parts very often are very young parts. And you said something about these parts making an incorrect assumption about things. I am the doer. I did this. This was the outcome, and I didn't like it, or it was frightening, or it shouldn't have happened like that. So I'm not going to do that again. If it's making it. But what they talk about is, rather than assumptions, is coming to these parts come to incorrect conclusions, which is sort of more concrete than an assumption. I know it's all words, but something that perhaps could be changed. Whereas these young parts, or even older parts, come to these incorrect conclusions that are absolutely unchangeable until your conditions change. I just wonder if you could expand a bit on what you understand by when you talk about parts, and for me that come to incorrect conclusions. I don't know, I'll give you an example.
Yeah, so when I talk about different parts of the human, I mean that we have, one way of looking at it is that there are layers. The human is made up of layers. So what I was just describing in the previous question was that there is a conscious layer of the human being, or the awareness, the conscious awareness aspect, and then there is the mechanical genes and up-to-date conditioning part of the body, for example. And to see the awareness layer of the human being as separate from the mechanistic functioning of the biological reactions, for example. And if you want, you can then put in the layer of the thinking mind, the psychological me that has, the guilt and the blame and the pride and the expectation. And all sorts of layers you can put in if you want. You can say, okay, the experience is broken into layers of visual, sound, taste, touch, smell. There are the thought layers, there are the emotion layers. And then you can, if you want, you can group certain layers together, like the sight, sound, touch, taste. You say, okay, they're all senses, so that's one layer. The senses is one layer, and then within that senses you have separate layers. Then you can have the thinking, and you can have the working mind and the thinking mind. So one layer of thinking broken into two layers of the working mind and the thinking mind. Then you can have the sense of self, or the awareness aspect, and see that the awareness aspect is aware of, let's say, the thinking, is aware of the mechanics of the body. But there are different functions, let's say, of the human being, which we're calling layers at the moment. And at the same time as breaking everything down into layers, we also have to appreciate that the layers are not separate from the whole. The layers make up the whole of the human being. But it does allow us to realize that there is a conscious awareness part that becomes aware of everything that has happened on other layers of the body, and that can be helpful to start to see ourselves as not the doer, because what is seeing and what is aware is, in a way, that which is aware of the outputs of the mechanical parts of the body. And so that's why I use layers. But what you were talking about, where we make assumptions about things, that's a type of thinking that is quite close-minded and problematic, because it doesn't appreciate the relativity of our thinking. And our thinking is by default very relative. We have usually very limited information about a subject. We have a whole range of intellectual biases that prevent us from interpreting the information and the circumstance in an objective way. Our brain is a very limited or relative instrument. So there's many relative aspects of our thinking and our conclusions. And if we form a conclusion and relate to it as if it's absolute, it's really bad thinking, because thought, our conclusions, are very, very relative. Limited information, a relative brain processing the limited information, and therefore the conclusion is going to be very relative and limited, not absolute. So as soon as we then relate to our conclusion as absolute, we've made a big mistake. So if we see this, if you see this, anyone listening sees this, it can become the proof that we need to stop taking things so absolutely and realize, oh, this is a conclusion I've come to, but then the word conclusion will mean something different to us. So we can say, I've come to this conclusion, but I don't hold this conclusion as absolute. So I don't hold it as something that I know to be absolutely true. And then our conclusions are very open to change.
Yeah, I get that. I really do understand that about this. Yeah. Because, yeah, these, when Dick Schwartz does this IFS, it actually talks to the parts. And one of the questions here is this, do you know that's true, or it did happen? Why do you still think it shouldn't have happened? Do you see what I mean? To actually bring that part into reality, that yes, it happened. Why have you come to the conclusion that it shouldn't have happened? And that's causing you suffering, if you're with me. But
yeah, indeed. I mean, this is a core principle. It's sometimes another thing is I don't know is what we need to realize. So to find oneself in a space of I don't know can be a very helpful period where we keep remembering, actually, I don't know. And what that tends to do is it tends to cut off the basis of suffering, which when we look at the basis of suffering says, for example, you often say, 10 years ago I was happy and now I'm not. And when you look at it, you might find that there's a basis that says, 10 years ago you had everything, now you don't have what you had 10 years ago. And maybe what you have now is exactly what you need for what's to come. And the suffering is quite sure that it doesn't have what it needs, or that it has lost what was very important. And so the parable of the Chinese farmer who understood this principle of not knowing, and when the series of events happened, some good things and some bad things happened, and his neighbors were all, always very certain that that's so bad and that's so good. And his attitude was, well, maybe. So let's see what happens. And invariably, what seemed like bad outcomes in the moment turned into a positive result down the track. And then the positive result down the track has the potential to turn into not so positive, which can then turn into a positive. And so at some point we open up and say, actually, I don't know if this is bad. It could turn into something wonderful.
Exactly. You can walk up the street and cherries and enjoy it and think, this is being alive. This is why I'm here. So yeah. Thank you, Roger. That really was very helpful. I'm always pleased to see you and talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I think we'll take one more question. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Roger. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thanks. First of all, I just want to say how much I appreciate your teaching, and I really feel blessed that it's my destiny to come across this teaching. So thanks for that. My question is, it could just be a simple answer to this question. If the sense of doership completely falls away, does the psychological me fall away with it simultaneously? Or can a psychological me remain just knowing now it's not the doer? Because obviously with the
no,
it doesn't. Because I said if the psychological me fell away first, then there's no psychological me to be a doer, and then so they would both fall away simultaneously. So.
To me, the psychological me and the belief in doership are the same thing. So if someone's belief in doership completely falls away, which is not something that is likely to happen, just out of the blue, I think it's a gradual wearing down of seeing life, coming to see life differently. So as we start to see, I simply cannot be the doer. Everything that is happening is interconnected with everything else. My thoughts are a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. There's far too many variables at play for me to know why something happened or what caused it. The more that we see that, if it becomes total, a total understanding that there is no one doing anything, as in there is no separate, independent doer doing anything, then that is the collapse of the psychological me. If we become if the concept of non-doership is taken on by the psychological me, then that isn't an understanding of non-doership. So a real understanding of non-doership is by default the dissolving of the psychological me. If the psychological me becomes the non-doer, as in says, I am not the doer, it's gone from being the doer to being the non-doer. And real non-doership is the dissolution of the one that is the doer or the non-doer. It's outside of the spectrum of someone being the doer or the non-doer.
Okay, yeah, I get that. That's great. Yeah, that answered the question perfectly. Thanks very much for that, Roger. Thank you.
Pleasure. Oh.